Turns out all this franchise needed was some more puns. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. As part of my 007 video series, today I'm going to be ranking the 7 Roger Moore Bond films. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. So what is a rankography exactly? Well, it's my ranking of a filmography, whether that be a director's output, an actor's appearances, or even an entire franchise. My rankographies are based on personal preference, and I rank movies according to how much I enjoyed them, rather than any specific technical merit or attribute. Remember, this is just my ranking, not the ranking, so be sure to post your own personal ranking of the Moore-era Bond films in the comments below. By the time Roger Moore took up the mantle of 007, we had already experienced a few Bond transitions. But as had been the case with every Bond actor, Moore put his own spin on the character and brought something unique to the table: his humor. James Bond had always been known for his quips and puns, but Roger Moore perfected the humorous delivery, which helped to pave the way for some of the goofiest, most over-the-top films in the franchise. Over the course of 12 years, Moore established himself as the most prolific Bond actor, starring in more official Eon-produced Bond movies than any other actor who came before or after him. I've already reviewed all 7 Roger Moore-era Bond movies, so if you want to check those out for some more in-depth thoughts on each of them, I'll put links in the description below and also link some of them up in the cards as we go along. Alright, let's get this rankography started. Coming in at number 7, For Your Eyes Only. Of all the Roger Moore films, this is the one that's always stuck out to me, and not in a good way. I know most people don't really have a problem with this one, but it feels like such an outlier to me. It's definitely got the goofiness you expect in a Moore Bond, but it doesn't have the story. Now, I'm not saying that any of the Bond movies are narrative masterpieces, but they're usually cohesive at least. No matter how many times I watch this movie, I really can't see it as more than a random collection of disjointed scenes. Luckily, it's not all bad though. This one has got a number of really entertaining and exciting action sequences. Some of them take the silly, ridiculous route, like when Bond inadvertently tries his hand at just about every Winter Olympic sport, but not everything is over-the-top goofy. This movie was released right after Moonraker, and serves as a bit of an attempted course correction, so we end up with some genuinely good action sequences too, like Bond's tense cliff climbing scene towards the end of the film. So, For Your Eyes Only might be my least favorite Bond movie from the Moore era, but it still has its redeemable qualities. Coming in at number 6, Octopussy. So, I went back and forth a bit with the placement of this one. It's pretty evenly matched with the film that ended up taking the number 5 slot, but I just never find myself thinking about or wanting to watch this one. I know it might be dumb, but I think the biggest reason for that is the name. I absolutely hate it. By far the worst title of any Bond movie, and probably a contender for the worst title of any movie period. I know you shouldn't judge a book by its cover or a film by its dumb name, but it always annoys me. I'm just glad I didn't see this one in theaters, because that would have been an uncomfortable ticket booth experience. One for Octopussy, please. The movie itself, though, is a bit better than its name would suggest. Obviously, I still think it's pretty low tier within the franchise, but at least it has all the pieces you need for a Bond movie. Like most of the Moore films, it's got some really fun, ridiculous action sequences. And unlike For Your Eyes Only, this one's actually got a story. It's definitely a weird one that takes some odd, random turns and makes a few questionable choices, but at least it tracks and sorta makes sense. There are definitely a few too many clowns in this one, though. Coming in at number 5, A View to a Kill. So, I know this is one that a lot of people would put at the very bottom of the Moore list, but there's something about it that kinda draws me back every time. Like I said before, it was really a toss-up between A View to a Kill and Octopussy for the number 5 and 6 slots on this list. And while I would say Octopussy is probably the technically better movie, I just find this one to be much more rewatchable. It's not that great, but it still manages to feel like a genuinely fitting end to the Moore era. A View to a Kill does have a story you can follow, but this is probably one of the most random Bond movies. Nothing quite feels like it goes with anything else in this movie. We start off with a very 80s Duran Duran theme song, then have Bond snowboarding to California Girls by the Beach Boys. We've got people being brutally chopped up by underwater propellers, and then there's a goofy fire truck chase. And then we've got the strange, over-the-top cartoonish pair of villains, Zorin and Mayday, with their equally cartoonish evil plot. It's all mostly entertaining, but there's no denying that it's a really weird mix. Coming in at number 4, Moonraker. Even before I ever watched a Moore-era Bond movie, I had heard some things about this one, and not good things. I knew it was frequently regarded as one of the worst Bond movies ever made, and the prospect of James Bond in space certainly seemed to support that consensus. I had mentally prepared myself for the goofy worst of the worst, but this movie really wasn't what I expected at all. For a movie called Moonraker, there's really not that much moonraking, and for a movie topping so many worst of Bond lists, it's really not that bad. Even though very little of this movie actually takes place in space, this is easily the most ridiculous and goofy movie in the whole franchise. The plot is obviously absurd, and this whole thing is extremely campy. Jaws makes a return as a henchman here, and this time he takes on much more of a comic relief role. It's a bit unfortunate, but when the story finally makes it into space, it's kind of dull, and definitely not what you'd expect from Bond in space. Luckily, the rest of the film is actually pretty fun. If you go in knowing how ultra ridiculous this movie is, I think you might be pleasantly surprised with it. I know The Pigeon certainly was. Coming in at number 3, The Man with the Golden Gun. Of all the Roger Moore Bond movies, this is the one that's improved the most for me on rewatch. The first time I watched this movie, I really didn't like it. I thought it was very dull, and I honestly probably would have ranked it in the number 5 slot on this list. But I really judged this one too harshly, and I actually like it more every time I watch it. Despite the fact that the plot centers around finding a device that can turn the sun's energy into a death ray and stopping a villain whose third nipple gets mentioned and shown far more times than you'd probably like, this might actually be the most serious toned and grounded Bond of the Moore era, except for the car plane, of course. This movie's got some really weak secondary characters, though, in the form of the frustratingly inept Bond girl, Goodnight, and the inexplicably returned J.W. Pepper. But I can mostly overlook those character disappointments, because this movie gives us the man with the golden gun himself, Scaramanga. Just like the movie as a whole, I really didn't give this villain the credit he deserved the first time I watched this film. He seemed like a really gimmicky villain with the whole golden gun and the secret island funhouse lair and the third nipple, but he's actually one of the most evenly matched villains that Bond ever encounters in the whole franchise. Not only is he an assassin first and foremost, but he's also pretty much a dark mirror image of Bond, and raises some really interesting questions about who Bond would really be without the oversight and control of MI6. Coming in at number 2, Live and Let Die. The Moore era starts off with a bang, not to mention one of the best theme songs in the whole franchise. Connery's final Eon film, Diamonds Are Forever, was pretty campy, but Live and Let Die really sets the bar for all of Roger Moore's films to follow. This one definitely embraces its silliness, and thanks to Moore's comedic ease and prowess, Bond had never been funnier. I know that not everybody likes funny Bond, but even in all of the Connery films, he had his one-liners. Moore just perfected the delivery of those, and then proceeded to expand on that humor a bit. This is an extremely entertaining movie, but there's no denying that it's absolutely all over the place. By late Moore-era standards, this is pretty much par for the course, but for a new Bond just coming out of the gates, this was a really bold choice, but I think it worked. The tone bounces back and forth between semi-serious and absurdly comical, and the genre is even more jumbled. Seriously, I think you'd be really hard-pressed to confidently assign this movie to any single genre. It's an action movie, a comedy, a spy thriller, a crime movie, blaxploitation, swampsploitation, you name it. Yet despite all this crazy variation, Live and Let Die manages to be a movie with a fun, engaging plot that's pretty easy to follow. This one could have given my number 1 Moore film a run for its money, if only it didn't have my least favorite character in the whole franchise. So that means my number 1 Moore-era Bond film is The Spy Who Loved Me. Like Connery before him, it took Roger Moore 3 films to really hit his stride. He finally cracked the code to balancing the aspects of Bond to create an incredibly likable character. He just seems so comfortable and at ease in his role here, which really brings in this natural quality to help offset some of the otherwise potentially too silly aspects of the film. This results in easily the most well-balanced Bond film of the Moore era, and one of the best in the franchise as a whole. This movie does suffer a bit from having a fairly unmemorable villain with an evil scheme that's an overly familiar recycled variation of things we'd seen earlier in the franchise, but luckily, he's really not the focal point of the movie. I know it might seem a bit weird that the main villain is more of a secondary concern in a Bond movie, but it's actually really great, because it lets us focus on the most satisfying part of this movie, the interplay between Bond and his rival-turned-reluctant partner, Agent XXX. We'd had strong Bond girls in the past, but we had never quite seen this type of character dynamic. She and Bond have really great chemistry, but more importantly, XXX actually genuinely has an important role in the story, which unfortunately isn't often the case with Bond girls. So a fun story, a good Bond girl, and a great tonal balance helped to make this the pinnacle film of the Moore era. The really awesome car didn't hurt either. Alright, so that's my rankography of the Moore era Bond films. 7 movies, 12 years, and 1 huge dose of humor. What does your ranking look like? I'd love to see some reasoning for your order, so be sure to post it in the comments below. Remember, I've already reviewed these movies, so you can check those videos out if you want some more in-depth discussion of each, as well as my ratings, pros and cons, and even tailored film recommendations. And if you're interested in buying any of these movies, I do have affiliate links to all of them in the description below. I do get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insider information out of this rankography, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button, and if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more rankographies like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.